All right, we are rounding the corner. Got the second layer of the painting finished, and we're ready for the third layer. Now, in reality, most paintings are comprised of more than 3 layers, especially if you're doing a glazed painting. But for us, just to simplify our kind of process so that you can understand it better, we're just doing these 3 layers, okay? But just know as we go into this third layer, this layer could keep going and going and going and going in additional and additional and additional layers, just depending on how detailed you want to get, okay? So the same materials as we had before. I've gotten all of my my paint out of my Tupperware container. The rules are similar to what they were before. We are only using turpentine as a solvent right now. You're not going to use the turpentine at all to thin out the paint. What you're probably are finding is the surface of your painting is probably still wet from when you painted it, the other day. So it's actually going to be really great for blending, if you want to do some blending in there, working some subtle variations into some of these areas. That's probably what the case is going to be. The reason that we don't want to use turpentine at this stage in the painting is because if we added turpentine to this layer, it would dry faster than the underlying layer. And if the top layer dries faster than the underlying layer, then the painting will crack. Okay? It's actually called crazing. So I'm going to kind of go background to foreground, except this time I'm not going to have to address every area of the background and foreground. I'm just going to pick and choose the moments that are most important to the composition. So my focal point in this composition is going to be kind of in this zone. Okay? So I'm going to pick up any details or variations that I see down here, and I'm going to kind of strengthen contrast between the background and the foreground object here. I don't really want to get too much detail up here because that gets really close to the edge of the composition, and I don't really want the viewer's eyes to go in that direction. It would be hard for them to, be enticed to go all the way out here, and then, it's hard to get back, What I might also do is strengthen the contrast between this ground plane and this black box right here. Just to, if I give a little contrast, that allows my eye to be kind of pulled back down here and not get too caught up in just staying on the top third of the composition, right? And that'll further activate this area down here. So at this stage in the painting, what I'm going to be doing is just looking at smaller sections of visual information and adding some nuance. I'm not going to use pure white yet. Those will be like the very last marks that I make. The thing to keep in mind is when you're working within an area, for example, if I were going to apply some color here, at this stage in the game, you're not going to apply any values, any new values that are going to be dramatically different than what's already there. Anything you apply is just going to be like a nudge darker or a nudge lighter. So let me get a good brush. I am using a smaller brush for this. I've got a kind of a small round brush. You can go a little bit bigger than this if you want to. Let me see. Yeah, your round brushes are perfectly wonderful to use. Angled brushes are fine as well. Just think about the shape of the marks that you want to make. And choose the shape of the brush that will be best suited for the task. Okay. You don't want the paint to be super duper thick. We just also don't want it to be too thin. So I'm going to push that even darker. So I've made a list. Y'all remember this little diagram. So we're kind of here. We're adding some of the flourish at the end. For your final stage, your third layer, one of the things that we're doing is we're adding variations of value, just mentioned, and those are mostly subtle. And we're also adjusting transitions. So where I want my transitions between values to be quicker or harder or stronger, for example, along the edge of this object here, then I might emphasize the value contrast, you know, on either side of that edge. So I'm gonna like slightly darken this area in the background here, and I can kind of work it into the area around it so it doesn't look like an outline. It's only a little bit darker than what I had there. But you might notice as I'm doing that, I'm darkening it, so I'm making that edge a little bit more crisp, but at the same time, I'm slowing this brush down, and I'm literally, actually getting a crisper edge just with brush handling. So if I want to strengthen an edge, that is, create a sense of space, right? Make something look like it's behind and something look like it's in front, I'm going to approach it from two angles. Okay, one, I'm going to get a slick, hard edge between the two value shapes, and that has to do with the brush, how I handle the brush. I'm also going to strengthen the value contrast. If even if it's just barely, kind of push a little bit darker, and when appropriate, pull a little bit lighter. Okay, so you're simulating that strength with values, and then you're actually creating a crisp or strong edge by getting a really slick. I'm going to do the same thing over here. It's almost black, but not quite. This is also helping me to refine some other edges. Just make sure that you're not drawing at this stage. Don't insert an outline. Cast shadows are okay. Ooh-wee. I'm gonna put, since this area right back here is already super dark, I am gonna use pitch black right back here. It's gonna give the impression that the top of that oil can is much lighter than it is. And it simulates that space. So it really is just taking it a little bit darker, but it makes a huge difference. Okay. It's only subtly different than what was already there. But it's just enough different, yeah, to kind of carve out that space. You'll notice a lot of times painters will use words that you would expect a sculptor or a ceramic artist to use. So like carving out negative shape, you know, that's applying paint in a way and of a value that just pushes space backward, carves out. Pushing and pulling, those are some other words often used. So you're definitely not repainting entire sections, you're just adding small moments within existing sections. And like I said, for the most part, the paint from yesterday, because you didn't, or your paint from the previous work session, since you did not use turpentine in that layer, it should still be wet. So you can kind of get a little bit of blending. All right. So something I am going to do along this back edge of the wall and ground plane, even though it's fairly close to me. I can see it. It's sharp. It's a strong edge. It's very obvious. I'm going to paint it a little bit softer than what I see. And that way, it will look like it's definitely farther behind some of these other edges, okay? Like the edge of the cube or the edge of the oil can. So if this edge here is slightly softer, it's going to help communicate space. So how can I adjust the transition between the background and the ground plane and make this transition slightly softer without it being over blended? Well, again, I can simulate that softness with value, and that is always my first go-to. So if the ground plane is this value and the background is that value, I'm going to try to find a value that's right in between them. If I don't have one already, I'm going to mix one. And I'm going to place that middle tone right between them. So that already softens it a little bit. I think that y'all had a 2D design project where y'all had to paint a design with value and you were not allowed to blend. So you had to simulate a blending or a softer transition by creating lots of steps from one value to the next. That's what we're doing. I'm going to continue doing that because it's giving me a lot of control. If you think about it, you know, things are not really blended so much as they are either quickly or slowly changing in how much light they're getting. So at every moment along the path, you know, between this ground plane and the background, the value changes ever so slightly, molecule to molecule. But you can see how that's sitting back just a little bit. Now I'm going to clean this brush and just right up where this edge goes behind the oil can, I'm going to barely just move some of the dark paint into the light paint. My brush is just kind of dancing on the surface a little bit. I don't know if y'all can see that very well. Let me see if I can get this. So I want you to be able just to, where am I here? There it is. Okay. Here, I think I can see that. So it's hardly doing anything. It's just barely kind of moving the darker paint into the lighter paint. There may only be a couple of bristles really hitting the canvas at any given time when you're just trying to be very delicate with that. So we don't want to like make it seem like it's on a, you know, a curved, you know, that the background curves into the ground plane. That's not what we're going for. We just want it to sit back in space. So as I do that, I can think about ways that I can strengthen the edge of the oil can so that it projects forward. So one of the ways I can do that, let's see, clean the brush and shape my brush. Now I don't want to get super light back here on the oil can because my light source is coming from here. So I'm not really going to lighten it as much as I'm going to just refine that edge. Get a quick transition. Ooh, that's light. Got a little bit too light. It's okay. It's just paint. And then down here, this is a little bit trickier, right? Over here, if I want to strengthen the edge between the left side of the oil can and the background, I don't want to make it much lighter. I've already, you know, on the oil can, because this is not what's getting the most light. You know, the background, I've already darkened it a bit. What could I do? What could I do? What I could do, what I might do is darken a little bit within this base shadow. kind of just make it, the oil can read a little bit darker, and then I might be able to kind of pull out a little bit of a reflected light on that left hand side. Do I want to do that? Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going for it. Will it work? I don't know. Let's see. Okay, so I'm just going to apply within the darkest shape within that base shadow. Yeah. And actually, as I do that, I'm adding that dark color. It's causing the left side of the oil can to look a lot lighter than it even was. So in trying to make it possible to lighten the left side of the oil can, I actually did not have to lighten the left side of the oil can. I was able to simulate that lightening by adding some dark around it. That worked well. Now while I'm playing with these darker tones, I'm going to add in a few moments up here. Some cast shadows on the form. I'm going to refine this ellipse. I'm going to lighten, while I'm up here in this zone, I'm going to slightly lighten this area up here. That's going to help me refine a few shapes as well. So just remember this light that I'm using, this light color that I'm applying right now, it's still a long way from the pure white. We're getting there though. So something that's really important at this stage is you're still doing a lot of looking. Sometimes when people start adding in a few details, they go on autopilot. Don't do that. Okay, don't do that. Because this is actually when you need to do the most looking. When it comes to the details, you're going to be looking at the subject at least twice as long as you're looking at your painting. You really only need to look at your painting to just place a few marks. So with every mark you make, you got to be looking, what is the scale of that shape? What is the scale of the mark? How does that value relate to what's around it? Okay, I'm going to put in, there's kind of a little bit of a moment. So y'all can let me know, in this demo especially, where the moments that I'm painting are really much smaller. If you need any demonstrations on specific types of objects, specific moments within those objects, and certainly tell me if you can see what I'm doing well enough for it to be beneficial. I hope it is. If it's not, I'll figure out a way to get a little bit closer with the camera. All right. there's this little tiny little dent right here. I think the values that I have are correct, but I think the shape is not. So it looks like it's kind of a half circle. It's not super dark, it's just a little bit dark. Okay, and it makes sense because that is kind of, you know, the light is coming from this direction. It's catching this top part. This dark part is like the top of a cave wall going in. And then what is illuminated, make sure I get it right angle. What is illuminated is a little small plane that's jutting out. So you know how I mentioned earlier in this video and maybe in another video too, that you should never put something that dries fast over something that dries slow. So it always should be, you know, the slower drying thing should be on top of the faster drying thing. Nobody ever told me that when I was learning to paint and when I was in college. Nobody told me that. And then for my senior show, I did these portraits in oil, and I had like started it with really thick paint, and then in the end I was kind of putting thin layers of other colors over it, but I was just thinning it out with turpentine. And it looked fine, it was fine up until like the day before we were putting everything up, and it's called crazing. It's like this crackle. You know, the top layer had dried and shrunken and was like chipping off of the bottom layer, and not in like a cool, you know, distressed or aged kind of look. It just looked wrong. It was mortifying. Absolutely mortifying. Let's see. All right. So now what I'm going to do, I'm just kind of looking for some little moments here. Some little moments that get slightly lighter. Remember that anything, any variation in value that you see within an area of dark, even if it appears really light, it is never going to be really light. It's never going to be as light as these values up here. So if you pull something out that's a little bit lighter down here in the shadows, it will only barely be lighter. Sometimes when you see something that's a little bit lighter, or you think you see something that's a little lighter, what it actually is that the area around it needs to be darker if it's in an area of shadow. So this is pretty much it, y'all. I am going to put a little highlight there. And then I'm going to push a little bit lighter, almost white, but not quite, out here, just to kind of get that little ridge on the bottom described. Here. Now, the last thing I'm going to show you is if you need to create a detail, and that detail, that tiny little shape, needs to have hard edges, like if it's not blended in with its surroundings, if it needs to have hard edges, but you know the surface is wet, you know, and it keeps kind of blending too much, then you can use a technique that's called scumbling. Now scumbling just means that you get, you know, a good bit of paint on your brush. I don't know if I can see if that's out of focus. It's kind of a glob of paint. I'm going to dab a little bit off. And rather than brushing the surface of the painting, you're really just placing like a little moment of thicker paint. So you're not brushing it on the surface, you're just, you know, setting it down on the surface and letting it be. And that creates a super crisp edge that reads almost like a highlight. Right? Now I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to, you know, work on this part. I'm going to do what I said I was going to do down here, adding in a little bit of light. I'm going to go ahead, I don't know, I'm a little bit hesitant to add a white highlight because this object really doesn't have much of it. Doesn't have many white highlights at all. I think if I add a white highlight, it's going to make it look like this oil can is like brass or really shiny gold, because it's so kind of rough and dusty. It doesn't really reflect light very lightly. So I'm not going to do white, but I am going to maybe strengthen this highlight right here. Little satisfying moment for the viewer. And I'm gonna get a little bit more specific down here, just for a moment. What the hell? I'm gonna do, again, I really don't think I'm not gonna use white, plain white anywhere on this. I think it would flatten everything. But I'm gonna do a little scumble, a little precise, just right there for a little bit of drama. You do not want to put your highlights everywhere. If your highlights are everywhere, then highlights are nowhere, you know? We only understand weight through weightlessness. We only understand light through darkness. So for this to be a meaningful light moment, it's gotta be, it's gotta have a counterpoint. Now these little highlights on this part are not light, very light at all. This is actually a middle tone. It looks lighter because it's on something that's darker. Let's see. All right. Okay, I'm going to stop there for the paint along demo, and I'll show you the finished piece. Oop. I'll show you the finished piece as soon as I finish it. Okay. So I've just got to, I'm going to work on this and I'm going to work on this.